I'm Lara Land, somatic coach and yoga teacher trainer, and this is the Beyond Trauma podcast. What a couple of years we have had. The challenges continue to grow, and more of us are experiencing some level of traumatic stress. My commitment here is to bring you the most up-to-date insights on exactly how trauma affects our mind, body, spirit system, and how we can work with our bodies to soften its impacts. You will be hearing from trauma survivors and researchers, and together, we are going to incorporate what they have to teach us to heal ourselves and promote the well-being of all those around us. Here we go. On today's show, we have Alexandra Seidenstein. Ali is a yoga teacher with nearly 20 years experience studying and teaching yoga. She was previously on the faculty at NYU in the biomolecular engineering program, where she remains a pre-medical advisor. She is all but dissertation for her PhD at the Bluestone Clinic at NYU, where her thesis research is focused on epigenetic, particular gene expression changes in response to PTSD. She is currently a fourth-year medical student pursuing orthopedic surgery and is the founder of the nonprofit Kids Who Care, holding over 20 years experience in advocacy and leadership. Ali's insights from her personal experience and scientific research on yoga and trauma are unparalleled. She understands Eastern and Western healing modalities and holds both in esteem and, in my opinion, correct balance. In this interview, we discuss the clinical definition of PTSD and epigenetics, what can happen to our DNA after trauma, the importance of science in validating what we yoga practitioners know to be true, loops associated with pain and trauma and how yoga can unloop or reloop us, and what Ali sees happening in the future of science and yoga research. We also talk about where to go if you are a yoga practitioner who's experiencing pain and how yoga teachers can help bond with their students more quickly and meaningfully. I am so excited about this interview. Please welcome Ali Seidenstein to the Beyond Yoga podcast. So Ali, we met in India. Do you remember, was it 2007, 2008?
I was going to ask you, I think 7 or 8 or something like that.
And you were definitely deep in the yoga, like I was as well. And yes. I have this image of you at the Three Sisters.
And I have the same one.
You were on your very long living in India. And now I find out like you're a PTSD epigenetic researcher. Like, what was like the route from, your deep yoga practice into that area?
Yeah. So we've joked about this before, but I kind of am always involved in a lot of things. And I think one of the big roots for me is that I ran a nonprofit so I started a nonprofit for abused and neglected children when I was 12.
When you were 12 years old?
Yeah, I know. I was in 7th grade and it was part of this, we had to write a paper and do a small act of service, and it just turned into a really big act of service. And throughout like my adult life, that's morphed into a lot of forms of working with people that have come from really challenged and traumatic backgrounds. And I think I love the physical part of yoga, of course, and I love what it did for me, but I always had this like vision of having more integration and more like psychological and physiological impact.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was teaching yoga in New York City at Ashtanga Yoga New York, I had this opportunity to like teach yoga for PTSD survivors in the Bronx and some other projects. And I think what came out of that was just like my real love for the deeper work of yoga and like the ways it can really heal things. And then while I was teaching yoga, I was teaching at NYU and I was doing my PhD, and this opportunity came up to work with Dr. Wieserat. And he had this project, and he's an incredible epigeneticist at NYU. And he had this project to work on epigenetics and PTSD, and it was just kind of perfect. I think PTSD kind of lends itself a more qualitative way of dealing with like trauma and stress.
What's your definition of PTSD?
So the definition we work with is based on the DSM-5, which is kind of the psychiatric and psychological qualifications to actually have a diagnosis. I can send you the chart that sort of has all the big qualifiers. The big thing is that there's been some sort of traumatic incident, whether you experienced it or somebody close has experienced it, and the repetitiveness of it in your like mind and body causes problems or, psychological issues or ways of, impacting your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great working definition.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can explain for folks what is epigenetics, because it's kind of a newer science, right?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we've all sort of known intuitively is a thing, that makes sense. But in terms of actually being studied like in a lab, it's new. And the basic idea, so I've written this out, which I've shared with you as part of yoga, like teacher trainings and traumas and articles. But basically the gene that we all sort of know about is, I've explained it before, is like the gene is like words in a book. So some things can change like our actual genes, but usually they don't change. And epigenetics is kind of markers and molecules that help the expression of those genes. So the easiest way to think about that, I always explain it as like you can have a word or a sentence in a book, but the highlighting of specific words and how much that word is read is epigenetics. So a great example that's used a lot in terms of biology would be like cortisol. So like we all have a gene that makes cortisol, which is one of the molecules associated with stress. But how much of that molecule is made is going to be different. And so epigenetics will look at how much of a specific gene is made into like a protein or a molecule.
Yeah, whether that DNA is kind of turned on.
Correct. Yeah. And off also.
And off. That's important as well.
Yeah.
And what have you found through your studies?
Yeah. So my actual research is using blood samples from people who have gone through different traumatic experiences. So in terms of PTSD and gathering like actual blood samples, war veterans is a pretty abundant available source just because they have blood samples before and after they go into combat. But I've also worked with data from 9/11 first responders and a couple of other what would be considered like more civilian traumas. And I think without getting into like the nitty gritty of like the actual genes, I think the exciting part of the research is that it's not even arguable whether or not there's a change. So consistently, there's a couple of hundred genes that are up and down regulated, but across all of the studies I've been looking at, which ends up being like 2,000 individuals, there's like 8 or 9 genes that are expressed differently before and after trauma, and they're using the own individual as the control. So they're actually using the person before or after the event, which kind of reduces other variables of just like what that differences among people. So I think that's sort of the big exciting thing. And I think it also changes like knowing that, like it always helps scientifically, like even if you and I know that traumatic experiences can really impact like our cells and our body, I think it's always nice to have science back that up and be like, yes, it does. And here's how,
Oh, absolutely. Because for a trauma survivor, being believed is one of the main influences in whether they're able to get through that trauma. So I think having science say, what you're feeling is real. And then from our perspective also as yoga teachers, knowing so much, like you're saying, in our bodies, right? Just like having such a knowledge in our bodies, but getting laughed at as kind of woohoo.
Yeah.
Now having that research out there, I mean, I've seen the way that people walk into yoga spaces differently.
Yeah.
Science is a way of validating what, these things that we've known.
Yeah. And I think we all need that. I think especially with trauma, it's a big risk when you've had things happen to you or you've had negative experiences or you're, at the precipice of really wanting to change your life, it's helpful to have all the validity to be able to trust something, because it takes a while for real change to happen or lasting change to happen.
It definitely does. Can you explain a little bit about maybe one or two of those 8 or 9 changes that you've seen post-trauma in the genetics or in what genes are being expressed? And
Yeah. So there's been sort of 2 parts of my work. So one was kind of reviewing like every paper that's been done on trauma and genetics. And I think the interesting part of that is that when I did like the big meta-analysis kind of review of everything that's been done, the same genes kept coming up. And the genes that were coming up as being up or down regulated significantly were mostly, as expected, part of like the axis that deals with like a stress, like a fight or flight response, like glucocorticoid receptors, which has to do with like cortisol. But I think those we can kind of like intuit or believe to be true. But I think one of the things for me that was so surprising, and they came up in the research analysis that I did also, was that there's also a lot of genes associated with healing and like cell proliferation or regrowth, which means there's a big impact on like inflammation, healing, a body's ability to like fight off everything from a cold to larger things. And genes that are associated with transport, so like the ability for your cell and body to like move molecules around, react to things, were also altered. So in addition to those like expected changes in like the stress, fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol that we're used to, there's also a lot of much more everyday kind of healing reaction genes as well.
that makes so much sense.
Like muscle repair, things like that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because the body is attending to the trauma. And we know that folks who have been through trauma, kids, they tend to, their growth is stunted. And we know that when we're stressed, even if it's not a traumatic stress, that our bodies tend to get sick more easily. Our immune system feels down. I know if I'm stressed that I'm going to get that cold.
Absolutely. I think we've all had that. Like, it's going to be a crazy month, and on top of it, you get sick.
Yeah. And just to see that at that level, that like the cells, like maybe your cut isn't healing as fast.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Can you relate that, like what you've seen at this cellular level, to what you saw when you were working with those trauma survivors, those veterans doing yoga? Did that come full circle for you?
Yeah. I think the big takeaway for me always, and this is something that's come up in the research that might turn into papers in the future, I think one thing that's important is that trauma survivors often have really interesting and very powerful tools to survive. And I think we often have this framework of it being all bad, but that's not always the case. Like the trauma is always bad, but the reaction sometimes has served purposes that can be beneficial. And I think when we think about somebody who's like really resilient, or we see people that have gone through horrible traumas, but they come out to be driven or CEOs or incredibly successful. But there's always a cost. And I think that sort of has been where the framework has shifted for me, is that sometimes we will have a tendency in society to like elevate people who have been through traumas and manage to be resilient. And it's true, it's incredible. I mean, I think we all wish we had a little bit of that, but there's always a cost. And sometimes the cost you can't see, like it'll be stress response, or it'll be healing, or it'll be susceptibility to other physiological problems. And so I think what really came out of this for me is that if you've been through something that's traumatic, even if you can't tell what the trauma is directly, because some people can hide it very well, or they've managed to get survival techniques that are incredible, that everybody has some sort of cost, even if it's just on a cellular level, that can cause problems. And so I think I saw regardless what the outcome was of surviving the trauma for everybody from like the PTSD survivors and the vets I taught yoga to I've also taught yoga and meditation for kids that are re-entering their biological homes. No matter what you see on the outside, because we know there's a physiological cost, having that like space on a mat or like a really safe space is always an incredible thing to witness, right? Somebody who's really resilient and really on it in some facets of their life might just get to relax in a safe place. Somebody else might notice that they haven't noticed they've taken a breath in like 2 years. And I think providing that space, regardless of what it looks like the person is going through, is always an incredible experience.
Well, you've spoken to so many important things right there that I just want to point out. I mean, one is the body's brilliant, really brilliant ability to respond to trauma, right? The traumatic event being something not right. And the body responds in such a brilliant way to protect the individual, and that has a cost, right? If all energy is going to remanaging the way that we work to protect us, then something isn't receiving attention or energy. That's kind of the basic layman way that I would understand it. And then you pointed out to, that the person might look really resilient, right? Or might not even really know that there's a cost there, but we should understand that something has happened to them and that we could have a sensitivity to that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And I think the other side of that is that there's always a benefit. I think sometimes I have this in my own life where you're so busy or things are going really well. It doesn't mean that you don't need to meditate or you don't need a safe space or you don't need to connect with yourself. Likewise, when there's a crisis or people are coming to terms with the traumas that they've been through or they really need help, it's so beneficial there as well.
Yeah, don't save your practice just for when things aren't going well.
Exactly.
Practice when things are okay. It'll be that much easier to practice.
Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah. And the benefits will be there to kind of work later. So such a good point. Sometimes we can use the practice like a pill.
Yes. And I also think, I don't think we talked about this much. I'm finishing med school next year. And part of that, I've gotten really involved with clinical trials for yoga with like treatment for pain, chronic pain and back pain. And with trauma, we get similar to pain loops, which can kind of go hand in hand. Our bodies really have this ability to loop on things, and pain and trauma and repetitive experiences. They also, to me, sometimes can kind of integrate as being part of the same thing or part of a similar experience. And I think yoga has and meditation and some sort of mindfulness practice has a really incredible ability to create new loops and new patterns.
Yes. Let's speak to that. I want to ask you one more question about epigenetics.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to that because the tendency to loop, to relive an experience is very strong in trauma survivors and in pain. And I learned a lot about that from your course, which I want you to talk about in a minute. I just want to ask you one more question that I know a lot of people have about epigenetics, which is about if these gene expression changes, if we know if they can be passed down to the next generation.
Yeah. Let me talk about that. So the short answer is they can. There was a couple of really incredible outcomes of papers on mice, of course, that dealt with really stressed out female mother mice. And also they did a really interesting one where they like program mice to be scared of certain music. And then like 2 generations later, the mice were still scared of the same relatively benign classical music. And I think the first foundational study for humans was they did an epigenetic study of people whose grandparents had been alive during the Great Depression, and that the grandchildren's bodies stored fat differently because of the grandparents having gone through like starvation mode. So they have repeatedly shown that these epigenetic mechanisms can be passed down. And I think we all sort of can like feel and intuit that. Like there are some things that we pick up behaviorally, like we might notice hand gestures from a sibling or a family member. But then there's also just ways that that are inexplicably similar to family members. So the short answer is yes. And if anybody is like needing an extra push to get out of their programmed ways, you can think of next generation. So there's absolutely that possibility. And they've definitely shown that on a cellular level.
Yeah, that's great to understand. It's just how deep and how passionate this stuff goes, why we are the way that we are.
Absolutely.
And I think that helps lead us exactly where you were going, Allie, because I'd love to hear what we can do about that.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think the really amazing thing, and potentially where some of this research will go if I have the time with residency, is that the incident of the trauma that caused, like in my research, we are talking about some sort of event that's markable just based on how research has to go. And not everybody that goes through the trauma. So for example, like the war veterans that were all in combat together and then came back, not everybody had these lasting epigenetic changes just based on how different people integrate it, I suppose. And it didn't happen right away. It's not like the trauma happened and then your epigenetics changed on the spot. The belief is really that it's the repetition that creates that. So it's that inability to get out of the repetitive memory. So that can be like people have dreams or they just can't stop thinking about it. And so when we see that, we see the value in repetition and how powerful repetition is. And I think you and I would agree that repetition and consistency is probably one of the most powerful acts in life, right? Like whatever you are used to doing, you continue doing. It's sort of the nature of being human. I think the amazing other side of that, that's so valuable to everybody, whether you're practicing a mindfulness practice or not, is that if you can create epigenetic changes from repetition of something that is absolutely awful, it means that we do have some power to make epigenetic changes on our own. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, a study that then just takes somebody who had epigenetic changes from something and then does some sort of practice and see if it changes. Although I think a lot of people would support the idea that that will eventually happen on a scientific level, and it will also be true. If we can have a traumatic event, go through the experience of repetition, have genetic change or epigenetic changes, then likewise, these mindfulness techniques, changing your life in small ways on an everyday level, also should have the same impact or a similar impact.
Wow, that would be a very cool study.
Yes, we're getting there.
Yeah. And so, like you said, you're sure that it would find that. Can you explain a little more about what practice is? A little bit about what you did with your course and the study of yoga and physiology and what you're finding.
Yeah. So the course that Lara's talking about was one that I wrote while I was teaching at NYU, and it's available on Coursera. It's called Engineering Health, Yoga and Physiology.
And we will link it for sure. It's so good. I feel like I'm back in my high school biology, remembering, but then learning new things as well.
Yeah, I think with that course, that was really, it sounds ridiculous, but that was really like a passion project for me. I was teaching genetics and molecular biology at NYU, and then I was also teaching yoga. And I really felt like the people teaching yoga that had this incredible message about healing needed the more scientific tools to be able to explain it. And I felt like likewise, there was a lot of misinformation in the scientific world about what yoga was. So I kind of wanted to have a place where we would explain the scientific side. There's links to articles that have done rigorous research on some of the benefits of yoga and meditation. And then I also had professionals, clinical professionals. There's like 2 surgeons, Dr. Wieserat's in it. There's a physical therapist in it that talk about what they believe are the benefits of these practices. So that's a really exciting thing to sort of have out there. Your other question about like what the practice is or how it works, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can explain. You did it so well in the course, and I really can't promote that course enough.
I appreciate it.
The links, the guest speakers, the articles, and the links that you're making, and really between, what we see that yoga can do. And specifically, you talk about yoga and mindfulness, right? Like, we have a lot of kinds of yoga, and you get into explaining a little bit about what has to be in place for new loops to be formed,
Yes.
patterns to be formed. And maybe, because I think a lot of yoga practitioners and teachers will be listening, what are the elements that we're looking for to make that positive change?
Yeah. Okay. I love that question. So with trauma and with pain, which are probably like two of the biggest areas that yoga's been clinically studied, it's all about changing up loops and setting new patterns. And I think we talk about in the course, it doesn't have to be yoga, right? There's physical limits to what people can do. And I know you've done a lot of work with what is the range of yoga. And I think the biggest thing, and I think you and I both have had this experience of teaching to different populations, is it's not really as much as we want to make it about the asana or the pose itself. It's really about, first of all, having a safe, intentional space. Yoga studios are great at doing that. COVID and life often gets in the way, and people have had to make their own space, which I think is really valuable. But the really important thing about yoga that makes it different than other forms of like exercise is definitely the connection between your breath and the intention of your movement. In addition to, ideally having a clear mind or a positive mind. But when you put these things together, you really have this unique healing experience that can kind of take this really mindless mode of living that I think we all get stuck in, like whether it's we're just doing in the dishes or we're talking on the phone or we're doing all of these things without really an awareness of what we're doing, how we're moving, what we're thinking. And so I think the course really highlights the intention behind something as simple as sitting and breathing or moving your body in an intentional way. And I know I've had the experience where I'm teaching people, and I know you and I have talked about this, where someone will be like, wow, I don't even know if I've paid attention to my breath in years. Or I didn't know I couldn't move my leg like this. Or they're surprised that when you say like, put your left arm down, they can't figure out where down is. And I think yoga has this really incredible ability to bring our minds back to our bodies, which are often really like kind of along for the ride of whatever's going on in our brains. And I think that's where we all get caught in a little bit of trouble. Like our brains move very quickly. Our minds have a lot of ideas and a lot of goals or a lot of thoughts or a lot of people, and are pulled in a lot of directions. And we don't really give ourselves like even 10 to 15 minutes of, I have to live in this body and I have to take care of it. And how am I really doing?
I love how you said that the body's just like along for the ride.
Yeah. I definitely feel like that some days.
Yeah. And it's like, I heard it described this way. I thought it was great around, so like around eating. You're already like taking the next bite. You haven't chewed the bite that's in your mouth, right?
Yes.
Just we're so far ahead. And just taking that time, 10, 15 minutes a day to be in the body and like see what's going on. Hey, body.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I've had the experience too, like it's not always bad, right? Like you have goals, people have families, they have so much that they have to do. It's amazing. Just because our mind is sometimes leading this really powerful movement doesn't make it bad. And I feel like that's really important because I think sometimes people think they need this whole overhaul. And sometimes it's just as simple as like, no, you just need a 5 to 20 minutes of something else, something rejuvenating. I've had people in med school like do 5-minute meditations or breathing, and nobody can believe it's 5 minutes. Nobody can believe the benefit to just that pause.
But what about folks who feel like it feels like hours for them, or coming into the body feels really unsafe and scary?
I think I'll ask you the same question because I think we've all had different experiences of what to do in that case. And I think it depends on the person. If it really is scary, as in unsafe for the person or they're dealing with traumas that are really haunting, I would probably say, like, first of all, they have to define what a comfortable space is then for them. I've had people tell me, like, they're not going to change their clothes, they're not going to take their shoes off, all of these things, which might seem small to somebody on the outside, but are a really big deal. And it can be something as simple as somebody will, they'll sit on their mat for 5 minutes, but they won't close their eyes. But I think what we've all noticed in life is that it's only a certain amount of time until you do feel safe, right? We've seen this with animals, children, people, they might need time to warm up. They might need adjustments made, but they do get there, right? So I think that's really something we need to switch the framework on, is like, not everybody has to go to an hour and a half yoga class, or can. If somebody doesn't feel safe, they can put music on. If they don't want to participate in the meditation, but they want to be there, as long as they're respectful for this space, I feel like we have to, as teachers and then also as practitioners, I think we just have to get much more sensitive and much more willing to work within different people's restrictions, as long as it's not damaging for anybody else.
Natalie, that's so good. Thank you for those tips, because I think sometimes teachers may not realize that that student that doesn't want to take their shoes off, it's like, it's not about you, right? They're not like rebelling against you, but that's what's making them feel comfortable in this moment. And if that's what brings them to class, so, we wipe the mat after, we wipe it after anyway, right?
Totally. They have shoe covers, right?
Exactly. And if that's the small thing that we can do so that folks can show up and get all those great benefits, then let's do it, right?
Absolutely. And I think also we've all had the experience too, where people have different responses to trauma, right? Somebody might have a response where they're scared and they're pumped to be there and they just love it off the bat. Someone else might have had a response where they've had to be guarded their whole life. And if somebody creates a safe space within what are reasonable requests, I think that sometimes forms this bond that people don't realize how much benefit can come from it. And I think it's really important to do that.
Yeah, just by saying, yeah, I'm open to you. I'm open to what your ideas are, what you're feeling, what you're wanting.
Yeah.
And from there, you can, like you said, you can have a quicker and deeper bond.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other practices that you've brought into your teaching style, specifically when working in traumatized populations?
I feel like one of the things, and I think the benefit to teaching for a long time to different populations, and I know you've spoken about this, is you get pretty good at being a little more flexible. You and I have practiced a traditional form of Ashtanga yoga for ourselves for a long time, but I think there's a lot of value in understanding that is not for everybody at all times in their life. And I think one of the things that I've really come out of all of it with, and also medicine and just the way life is often, is that you have to have a little bit of humor. People are going through a lot that we are often unaware of. I think humor helps. And I think as teachers or people that are holding the space, I think it's really important to allow everyone to be a little bit more comfortable with like quiet, uncomfortable silences. There doesn't have to be answers. There doesn't have to be resolution. We don't need to have someone come to a yoga class and then say they felt the best ever. They might feel awful. And I think being okay with all of the in between is something that's really important for everybody. It's kind of like the thing that comes up for me the most, right? And people need to hear that that's okay. Like, we all have good days. We all have bad days. We all have days that are just regular, pretty good days. And I don't think that the yoga or mindfulness practice that you're doing is any different. And it's one of the hardest things, I think, as teachers, is that we want everyone to come out of every class being like, that was the most amazing experience. And that's not always the case. And people's emotions don't always have to do with us as much as we want them to when they're good, you know?
I'm trying not to scream with like, yes, everything you're saying.
Yeah.
So much there.
Yeah. I think holding space for whatever people are going through, especially with trauma, is kind of your job when you're dealing with that. If there's things that they need that are within reason and you can work with, I think you have to give it. If they're really happy and it was the best thing ever, I think you have to let them have it. If it's the worst thing ever, I think you have to sit with them. And I think that's really what comes of all of it, because bringing it back to epigenetics, this all takes so much time. I wish there was like one quick answer for everything that happens in life, but there really rarely is. And so when you're talking about using this scientific background to allow people the space to undo these patterns that have been formed by absolute repetition in mostly a negative way, you're talking about something that's going to take a while in a positive way. And that means on a daily basis, you have to hold space for whatever's going to come up, you know?
Yeah, because it's not going to be linear, or it might not look like a linear process where I'm like getting a little better every day. And I think, and this is such an important point, if we can stop over promising what yoga can do, and especially in one class, and stop making it about us, but allow for all kinds of responses and humanness and humor, which you're great at adding humor.
You have to. This is, life is insane.
You always, there you go. It gets all crazy.
It's all crazy. Like, can't forget that part.
Yeah, let's like lighten it and allow for all the sticky, strange humanness in the space. And if we can stop predicting, which is interesting because you're a scientist and you're on your way to becoming a doctor and a PhD, and like predictions or like hypotheses probably part of what you do. But what's amazing for me is to go in and be curious and be always in that beginner mindset.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I do this research because the world needs it. And it's always so funny. But like I always say, which is probably horrible, and I apologize to any scientists out there that I'm offending, but I don't feel like I need it. I feel like I know that if my mind is uncontrollably racing over something that's bad, I'm going to feel awful. I know that if I'm stressed, I'm going to get sick. And I know that if I'm doing things for myself, I'm going to feel good. I love science and research, and I love putting things out there that help other things. Like maybe one day yoga will be covered by health insurance. Like I'm driven by all of those possibilities, but I feel like I know that it's good, And I feel like the other thing is like there's this sort of joke in yoga. It's certainly in medicine that like if something really good happens, it's the doctor or it's the yoga teacher. But if something really bad happens, it's something else. And I think the important thing we have to hold is that it's really neither, right? It's really not either or. It's really that place where healing takes time and it is all over the place mostly.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of factors that come into our healing. I mean, if we're going to yoga class once a week or twice a week or even once a day, that's only a sliver of what's going on in our lives.
Yeah.
And maybe you want to share some other things, Allie. Doesn't have to be from your research or just maybe from your life experience about nutrition or other therapeutic or healing modalities that you've experienced or you've shared with people that could also be helpful.
I would love to. So the first thing I will say about that, and that kind of goes with the same idea of, not everybody needs or can do an hour and a half yoga class. And I think I myself need to listen to myself saying this. I don't think we should undervalue what like 5 minutes can do. And I think there's a real human condition where we start to be like, if I can't get to the gym, I'm not going to work out. Or if I can't do the whole yoga class, I'm not going to do any. And I know that I've had the experience in a busy day, in a busy life, in a busy rotation where I'm like, wow, like 5 minutes is amazing. And I just like would shout that to everyone I know, like everybody has 5 minutes. You can find 5 minutes. I know it. Like you can pretend that you're going to the bathroom for 5 minutes, like there's 5 minutes and there's meditations everywhere, like good ones, bad ones, find one for you. That we have so much access now. The other thing is, like there's a lot of things that we can do for our health. I tell patients all the time, like taking walks, sitting outside, sitting quietly with people you love. All of those things can be like, as soon as we shift the perspective that we live in these bodies and they need attention, they're not just here to like, shovel our minds around, but like we actually have to care for our bodies. That can look a lot of ways. But I think we have to get in our brains that that's part of it. Nutrition is a really big part. Obviously in medicine, it's something I'm doing every day, talking to people and patients about. What can they do? What can they cut back on? I myself, I've been vegetarian my whole life. So, I take with that a lot of components. So like from a health perspective, which is how it started in my family, but of course, like an ethical perspective for me personally. But I think more value needs to be put on just the fact that like you're living in a body that you need to care for. And whatever that is for you, I think it can have a really big impact. I recently did like a family medicine rotation, and part of it, I made this huge handout of like healthier options to eat at like every fast food restaurant. Because I think we have to remember that we always have a choice. There's always something we can do for our bodies that are a little bit better. My big advice from like a nutrition thing is just, do you recognize what the ingredients are? Like, are they words to you? Because I think packaged foods and a lot of like preservatives and things are really bad. But I think for everybody, food and what is good to eat means something different, which we have to be really mindful and aware of. I don't think there's like one diet that works for everybody, but I think everybody in every culture can agree that like your food should be nourishment. There should be some consciousness to it. There should be like belief behind it. Not every day, not every meal, but as a general rule, that's what I would say. That and water. Everybody needs to drink more water.
Yeah. And being outside and
Yeah, exactly. I was always a really big like nature person and hikes and everything. Training in a hospital, I have a new appreciation for like 5 minutes of sunshine. So I think like that's something I've been talking about a lot, is that the amount of time you have to give everything doesn't have to be so big. And usually there's a way to figure it out. Like somebody might not be able to make the time daily for yoga classes, but they might have time for a health coach. Somebody else might have goals that are able to be attained if they're like 5 minutes outside, 5 minutes for me, 5 minutes meditation. If not, and you're an advanced practitioner that has time, that's also amazing. But I think shifting that idea to like, we have to take care of our bodies. We just have to.
yeah. And we have to take care of each other as well. And you sent me something, I think today or yesterday, that I didn't know you were a part of, which is more about, can you tell me you're on the advisory committee